Here we go again, continuing our journey with 2nd Isaiah that we introduced and talked about last week in terms of what the message of 2nd Isaiah has to do with our life today. But now we're going to look this week at how 2nd Isaiah really impacted and influenced the life and teachings of Jesus. Now let's remember these exilic preachers of the exile. The first prophets we dealt with, the first preachers, they had a vision of what ought to be, but all of a sudden the exilic prophets gave a cause, and Ezekiel really emphasized the cause of understanding God to be the God of all people. And then, as we introduced last week, 2nd Isaiah gave a new reason for being, and that was to be a servant people. A broken reed will not be broken, and a dimly burning wick will not be extinguished. And so that was where we were last week. But between 540 BC, when the 2nd Isaiah probably was written, until 600 years later with the ministry of Jesus, what happened during those 600 years? Well, first of all, Cyrus defeated Babylon, and all of a sudden it was the Persian Empire. And then under Persia, the Jewish people were allowed to experience that new exodus of returning back home. But then the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, came along and introduced all kinds of intellectual fervor to that area of the world. But that didn't last for very long before the Roman Empire came along. And the Roman Empire gained an economic foothold first, and a political foothold in the Western world, and superiority. And the Jewish community was sort of a neighborhood identity in and around Jerusalem under the Roman Empire. They had an identity, not as a nation, but as a place for them to be. And during this time, the temple was rebuilt, sure enough. Not as the headquarters of a nation, if you will, but as a place of liturgy, a place of worship, a place where God was experienced, as over against the understanding that that's where God was contained. But a new temple was built. Now, let's look at it with this happening. That's the world that Jesus was born into. And in his formative years, between his visit to the temple at the age of 12 and his baptism, the beginning of his ministry, during those about 20 years, Jesus had that understanding of his world. He was a part of the Roman Empire, knowing how empires came and empires left, knowing how the Jewish people all of a sudden were given a new identity by these exilic prophets, a new cause, and Jesus' own understanding of what it meant to be persons of love was impacted certainly by 2nd Isaiah. So let's look first of all at an influence that is so meaningful in terms of dealing with the relationship between God and humanity. A real shift that Jesus taught and lived. God is not dependent upon the faithful. The faithful are dependent upon God. to take that a step further, God is not possessed by the faithful. The faithful are possessed by God. And that was Jesus' teaching. Now, the gospel, according to John, identifies God as God is love. So let's substitute the word love for God and this shift that I've just articulated. Love is not dependent upon the faithful. The faithful are dependent upon love. Love is not possessed by the faithful. Rather, the faithful are possessed by love. And this shift in terms of who owns who, if you will, this shift of whether or not we're on God's side or whether or not God is on our side. That whole shift is what Jesus articulated so carefully. And looking back at what we dealt with last week, remember the first Exodus, the people carried God. In the second Exodus, God was going to carry the people. And Jesus, in his own life, in his own teaching, and in his death, remember the words, "Nevertheless, God, not my will, but thine be done." Jesus' life was one in which Jesus' self-understanding was that he was possessed by the God of love. It's a different understanding to think that we possess God as over against God possessing us. And Jesus' teachings and life into his death was a self-understanding that he was possessed by love. Now, this second way that second Isaiah really influenced Jesus was in, Jesus really took on the mantle of servanthood, if you will, that was first articulated clearly by second Isaiah. As we said before, what the first prophets talked about a vision, the exilic prophets talked about a cause, Jesus talked about a way of life. Not just a cause, but a way of life, of servanthood. Let's just take a quick survey of the bruised reeds and the dimly burning wicks in Jesus' life. Remember the epileptic? Remember the blind? Remember the lepers? Remember the children? Remember the widows? To summarize the bruised reeds and the dimly burning wicks, the best word is that they were the marginalized. They were on the edge. They were the leftovers and the left outs, if you will. As we've mentioned before, the word translated multitudes in the New Testament can also be translated the marginalized. The marginalized were the bruised reeds and the dimly burning wicks. And his understanding of his own life and teachings and his call for others to follow him was to put others first. And we read in Mark 8:34, and he summoned the marginalized with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit one to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? All of a sudden you see Jesus in his teachings and his call to the disciples had that understanding of servanthood, that you just got to unload a whole bunch of stuff and decide to be a person who serves others, especially the marginalized, the bruised reeds, and the dimly burning wicks. There's a book that I cherish. It's the story of Maximilian Kolbe. It's entitled A Man for Others. He's another Bonhoeffer that died during the Holocaust. But that theme, A Man for Others, was his self-understanding of who Jesus was, a servant of all, a man for others, that Maximilian Kolbe wanted and desired to be, and according to those who knew him, he was. It's written in this book on page 101. Nevertheless, when an individual has thrown everything away for the pearl of great price and becomes one with God, one with love, then like a great silent river hidden under the visible trickle in the sandbed, beneath the real worries and cares of each day, there is a peace and joy beyond words. Some of us know a lot about the Arkansas River flowing through Kansas. After the John Martin Dam was built out in Colorado, all of a sudden the western Kansas rivers that used to flood western Kansas sort of got dammed up. And now in the dry summer, you can drive the riverbed from Syracuse past Garden City down to Dodge City and never get the wheels of the four-wheeler wet. But underneath there's a stream. And that's what Kolbe discovered in his life, and that's what Jesus discovered in his life. That as you serve, there will be difficult times, and there were difficult times for Jesus. But underneath that servanthood, there's a stream of peace and joy. You know, enough is probably said before we go to preaching. Third thing that really had an impact on Jesus was the theme in 2nd Isaiah of radical inclusion. Cyrus is the best illustration of that in 2nd Isaiah. But God is the God of one's neighbor. God is the God of one's friend. God is the God of one's enemy. God is the God of the powerful, of the weak, the poor, the rich. For God is love. And love is the eternal demand, according to Jesus, for inclusion, not exclusion. I think John 3:16 is the most quoted and least followed verse in the Bible. It does not read, God so loved the church. We act like that sometimes. Or God so loved people like me, or God loved people of my color, of my skin, or God so loved my country. It's not what it says. God so loves the world. This was Jesus. Radical inclusion of all as children of God. Needless to say, we see so many evidences of the influence of 2nd Isaiah on Jesus. And so let me leave you with some questions to think about before we talk about it on Sunday. I guess first of all is the question, what are the contemporary illustrations of the faithful trying to possess God rather than being possessed by God? Secondly, as we commit to follow Jesus, what are we required to lay down and leave in order to be those who live for others? And finally, in 2020, for us, who are the most difficult to include in God's circle of love? Enjoy reading, enjoy thinking, and we'll look forward to enjoying Sunday morning together.